It's always nice. Yeah, yeah. No, that's the line. That's the line.
Oh, okay. Okay, can everyone hear me? It's the end of the day, it's the end of the second day, which gives us a dual challenge. One is to keep you awake and keep you entertained and active, and the other is to summarise everything we've heard in the last 2 days and provide the means to achieve the solutions that we've talked about as well. So we're going to do that by practicing what we preach and to introduce the session in partnership, and then talk about, we're going to hear a few examples of existing partnerships and lessons learned from those, but all of which are kind of couched under or linked to what's known as the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, or the 10YFP. I always have to apologise for the acronym and the long name. But Charlie is going to talk a bit about what exactly that is, and then I'll speak more specifically on a couple of things and pass over, and then we'll finish with as much of a conversation and question and answer as possible. Charlie, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So I'm Charlie Clark. I'm the head of the Secretariat of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production, which is an international capacity building and cooperation framework that was adopted at Rio+20. It has 6 programs. On the podium here you have representatives from 2 of those programs, consumer information and food, because we thought they were of the most interest to ITC's network working on sustainable supply chains. And this session is very much about a kind of offer of what's going on in those 2 programs on sustainable food systems and consumer information in an effort to increase the number of partners working alongside those programs, and really from our perspective to forge some strong partnerships with the ITC network on sustainable supply chains. So there are already some partnerships, and ITC is also already in the steering committee of 2 of the programs, the Consumer Information Program and the Sustainable Public Procurement Program. No, I think they're apart. Not yet the food program, but obviously with the collaboration with all your collaborators on food. It's multi-stakeholder. It is helping governments to design and implement policies for sustainable consumption and production. It's helping the private sector implement practices for sustainable production. It works a lot with the demand end, and there is a strong emphasis on sustainable consumption. In fact, 3 of the programs, one is on sustainable lifestyles and education, one is on sustainable public procurement, and one is on consumer information. So one particular value added of this framework is we have a lot of practitioners on the demand side here who we think could complement the networks that you have in the ITC Sustainable Supply Chains Network, which are more on the producer side than on the consumer side. So I don't want to say more than I'm really here to answer the odd question that may be about the overall framework. I would just say that the first target in SDG 12 is implement the 10-year framework of programs. The 10-year framework of programs is actually the only UN initiative mentioned anywhere in the SDGs. So this was quite an important, endorsement of the 10YFP, and we were fortunate that the 10YFP came about 3 years before the SDGs, and so you actually have a ready-made implementation mechanism and a total of more than 500 partners in these 6 programs to help with implementation of that goal and some of the other sustainable consumption production related targets in the SDGs.
Thank you. So, my name's Ian. I work for Consumers International, which is kind of a partnership itself. We have some 250 member organisations, which are consumer groups, consumer organisations, and they range from small, quite campaigny civil rights movement activists to very much larger organisations that work with companies or governments or work against companies and governments. So we have a broad base to work with, some of whom as well just don't work on sustainability. So we decided that the best way for us to gather and promote and work with all of those vast different interests of our members was by working in partnership with the UN on this, this model, this platform, the 10YFP. Part of the reason for that is that we then get to work with a very wide and impressive different amount of stakeholders that you'll hear from today, and many others, and hopefully people in this room as well. As Charlie mentioned, yeah, we're boosted by the fact that the 10-year framework of programs is, has this mandate, if you like, under the SDGs. But what we're not is, or what we don't have is a big pot of money to just go and do anything and everything that everyone that's involved wants to do. We're a kind of collective movement that works on the strength and the expertise and the ideas of everyone that's involved in partnership. So it's a collaborative exercise and everyone's working together on a set of agreed aims. I'll talk briefly about 2 programs before introducing the speakers in turn. So the Consumer Information Programme, our objective is to support the provision of quality information on goods and services and effective strategies to engage consumers in sustainable consumption. So often that does come back down to food because it's the most obvious, the most tangible and important aspect of consumption for people everywhere. And it often comes back to standards. And a big premise of the programme is that actually consumers are confused and find a lot of mistrust in the vast array of standards that are already out there. They don't understand which to trust, which to back. There are so many going on, it doesn't actually help them with the information that they gather. So we've heard about the challenges that SMEs and smallholders find in that array of standards, but also there's consumer confusion there. So we want to try and harmonise that, work in partnership with different standard organisations, use tools like Standards Map to try and refine that information and make it more accessible. That's one mode of working. And just briefly, so we as Consumers International lead the programme alongside the Environment Ministries of Indonesia and Germany. And as Charlie mentioned, we and every programme under the 10YFP are supported by an advisory committee who helps set the agenda, the objectives, and the areas of work that the programme works on. And that's then how we try and bring in other actors, partners like yourselves, hopefully, to try and work on that together. On the other side, briefly, the Sustainable Food Systems Programme. They work on 5 areas: sustainable diets, sustainability along all food value chains, reduction of food losses and waste, local, national, regional, multi-stakeholder platforms, and resilient, inclusive, diverse food production systems. So everything under the food system and helping to make it more sustainable. So, as I say, all of the speakers involved are involved in the 10YFP in one of these 2 programmes. We'll hear a bit about what their own institutions are working from or have learned through partnership working, but also to try and tease out a bit about what the 10YFP has been positive as a partnership model for them, or to get them to push back on us as to what we should be doing, how we should support, and then have all of you ask your own questions and give your own ideas as well. So, I'll pass first firstly to Beatrice, who will talk about one example of partnership working that we've already run under the 10YFP Consumer Information Programme. Just click through that there. Thank you.
Can I take you?
Yes.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. So, a part of the role of the Secretariat of the 10YFP, UN Environment is also part of the advisory committee of the different programs. So I speak here on behalf of UN Environment as a member of the Consumer Information Advisory Committee. So I am going to talk about one example of partnership, of how the 10YFP programs can foster partnerships. So it's about the guidelines for providing consumer information, for providing product sustainability information. And the objectives of the guidelines are to improve the reliability of consumer information for sustainable consumption through international consensus. Actually, try to build international consensus on the principles to provide consumer information. Set a common ground of minimum requirements to remove potential greenwashing. So we have developed a set of 5 minimum criteria for providing consumer information. To actively encourage organizations to take leadership and communicate quality, useful information to consumer. So we also developed 5 we call aspirational principles to provide consumer information. And also to offer a tool to address the Sustainable Development Goals, in special the Sustainable Development Goal number 12 and the target to 12.8. So we target as audience the companies, the retailers, government and NGOs to follow and apply, the providers and designers of information. So we're talking about here, like the marketing people also, not only the companies, and also the NGOs that work as watchdogs or whistleblowers to pay attention on these principles and to check if the market actually offers the consumer information that we need to, in fact, change the consumer behavior. And we also target countries in developing countries and companies at all sizes. It's important to mention that these guidelines were developed in collaboration with ITC. So it's a joint product was developed with ITC. Okay. So the development process started in 2015 with an scoping exercise to identify existing guidance, relevant initiatives, and stakeholders. Actually, we built the guideline on existing documents and initiatives. We didn't want to do anything completely new, to rediscover the wheel, so we built on existing things that were working in their relevant fields. So in June 2015, a working group under the Consumer Information Program under the 10YFP was created, and the members were so we had this we launched this call and see which stakeholders want to be part of this working group. So working groups under the programs are a very effective way of engaging stakeholders and foster partnerships. So from 2015 and 2016, there were 6 webinars and 1 workshop to develop these guidelines. And from August to October 2016, we launched a global consultation, online consultation, to receive feedback from different sectors and regions. Through this online consultation, we have received more than 90 contributions from all regions. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about some lessons learned during the process of developing those guidelines. So first, which is what I mentioned before, that the working groups are a mechanism to connect relevant actors from public, private, and third sectors, and from all regions, developing and developed countries. So we can take into consideration all regions' concerns for a global product. That's what we aimed doing these guidelines. We can benefit from existing work, so the different stakeholders involved in the working group in developing these guidelines, they brought their experience, so we could benefit from what they were already doing. It was an inclusive process built on, and we tried to build the consensus and ensure ownership and community sense among all the stakeholders involved. So an example of it is that the guidelines have been presented by multiple stakeholders, not only UN Environment and Consumers International, but other partners. And also, many of those stakeholders involved, they will work as help desks in our road test that I'm going to mention at the end of my presentation. So they have really a strong sense of ownership about this project that we developed together. And at the end, another lesson that we have is that it helps to work towards a concrete goal with a defined timeline. So when you are talking about a cooperative work like that, it helps a lot if you work towards a concrete goal, an agreed and concrete goal, and with a defined timeline. So we also learned that, and this is not like, these are the things that we need to take advantage in next projects to be aware of, that it's very important that we have a person or an institution that coordinates the effort and delegate and share to ensure ownership. So it's two sides of the same thing. In one hand, you want everybody to take part of it and to feel like to have ownership of it, but without someone coordinating the whole process, it's very hard to keep up with the deadlines, to share all the information that's relevant. So a key person dedicated to coordinating the effort is very important. Another thing is that, of course, we need funding and the voluntary inputs, like the in-kind contributions, needs to be agreed and organized and committed. Otherwise, it's very difficult also to reach the targets we are expected. And the coordination of an inclusive process, such as this one, it involves many stakeholders and regions, frequently leads to a very lengthy process. So it's something that it needs to be taken with patience, that we have to agree on actually feasible deadlines, because it takes more time than someone that sits on its desk and do like by their own. So these are the lessons that we learned during this process. And I was not part of it because I just joined UN Environment, but Ian was and ITC was, so Joe, so if you want to ask them like something more specific, so feel free to, and you feel free to jump in if you want to add something. So the lessons learned, yeah. So I'm just talking a little bit about the guidelines itself. So as I mentioned, we agreed on 10 principles. 5 of them we call fundamental principles, and 5 of them are aspirational principles. So about the fundamental principles, we think that the information provided should be reliable. So the reliability of the information is that you build your claims on a reliable basis. The information needs to be relevant. What does that mean? That make sure that the hotspots are covered in the information that you are providing. The other one is clarity. The information is useful for the consumer. The information should be transparent to satisfy the consumer's appetite for information and do not hide. The information needs to be accessible. So the information should get to the consumer and not the other way around. And the principles that we call aspirational, which are the ones in orange, So that we should envisage to have the 3 dimensions of sustainability, show the complete picture of the product sustainability, not only one of them. It should aim for behavior change and longer-term impact, like the consumers be encouraged to play a role where appropriate. It should be a multi-channel and innovative approach to engage with consumer in diverse ways. It should be collaborative, so the company should work with others to increase acceptance and credibility. And at last, it should be comparable to help the consumers choose between similar products. So if we have a comparable information, it makes life easier for consumers. You see that in the next presentation, and we'll show like a practical example applied to the food sector and from Nestle, and she will show it after my presentation. So this was just to give you a taste of the guidelines. And so we just confirmed a launch of the guidelines for that will happen at the World Resources Forum on October 24th here in Geneva. And so yeah, well, this is, I talked a little bit in the, so we are now launching the road testing, and I am here today to launch a call for participation. So we are looking for companies, certification schemes, label schemes to test these guidelines to see if they make sense, if those principles make sense, if you can actually apply what is there. So we are calling for people to be the road testers of the guidelines. So the objectives of the road test is ensure that the guidelines are actionable and to test applicability of provisions over regions, sectors, and target groups. To build a library of case studies from different regions and sectors, and assess how existing claims and schemes meet the guidelines principles to improve the way they communicate. And this will be a non-disclosed exercise. Only the companies or the schemes that want to have their information disclosed will be. We will be going for case studies that will be present in the event that we are going to do at the end of the road testing. And also we will have this library of case studies which will be part of future publications. So anyone who wants to be part of the road testing, it's very welcome, and come and talk to me afterwards, or to you. I think this is it, and yeah, we're going to launch the guidelines at the World Resources Forum on October 25th here in Geneva. I think this is it.
So we are actually part of the 10YFP on sustainable food systems, and Ian asked me before I go into the rest of it to explain why we joined this. Well, firstly, as the world's biggest food company, we firmly believe in sustainable food systems. It's our responsibility to nourish the world sustainably, 2050 and beyond. And secondly, it's in the spirit of SDG 17, partnerships. No one organisation, certainly not Nestle on its own, but no one UN agency or NGO can do it. We have to work together. The problem is so complex to really have sustainable food systems. So this is why we joined the 10YFP, and with 9 governments, NGOs, UN agencies, academic institutions, and some members of the private sector, we believe this is a platform that things can happen. So we are part of the multi-advisory stakeholder committee of the Sustainable Food Systems Programme. But actually today I was asked to present a case study relating to consumer information. Now, we weren't actually involved in developing these guidelines, but I'm going to tell you how they can be applied. So, hopefully. So, Beatrice has already explained the 10 principles, both the fundamental principles and the aspirational principles. And when I studied the draft guidelines, I found that we were actually already doing all these things. And for a number of years, we have had a standard, which is we call the Brands and Creating Shared Value Communication Standard. And this is a mandatory standard that is audited internally within the organisation. And this sets the framework around communication in this area. And we really put it in place to avoid greenwashing and avoid communication that was inappropriate. Linked to this is this thing called NESICA, Nestle Solution for Environmental and Social External Communications Approval, and that explains the process of who has to agree before a claim is actually made. So I'm going to illustrate this with the Nescafé plan. The Nescafé plan, we've actually invested 350 million Swiss francs, will be over the period 2010 to 2020. Now, as you look at the communication, consumer communication guidelines that have been issued, as I said, it's an excellent set of guidelines, but in reality, you cannot communicate on all these things at the same time. And so what I want to do is illustrate some examples of targeting the communication specifically for a certain message or relevant for a certain country. But the whole thing has to be grounded on things that are really happening, things that are really working and being active on the ground. So the Nescafé plan is based on 3 pillars. The first is connecting with farmers, so improving the long-term viability of coffee farming and the quality of coffee. So this is what we call, partly what we call agripreneurship, how we can make coffee farmers more business savvy, more financially literate, etc. It's looking at increasing yields and quality beans. So here you'll see we are actually breeding and delivering plantlets to farmers. The second is connecting with communities, so projects with coffee farming communities, a lot about empowering farmers, especially young people and especially women. And then connecting with our planet, so this is protecting the environment along the value chain, particularly water use in agriculture. As you know, the biggest use of water in the world is in agriculture. Looking at biodiversity, soil facility, and energy and greenhouse gas emission reduction. So this is the base of the Nescafé plan. This is what we're actually doing. Some of the numbers, we've got a million farming partners. We've got 364 agronomists and field staff working with farmers on the ground in 20 countries, 36,000 farm visits a year, 100,000 farmers receiving assistance. By the end of 2016, we've already distributed 129 million coffee plantlets, and these are bred to be more high yielding and more disease resistant and more resistant to climate change. Our target is 220 million by 2020, and then you can see the numbers of responsibly sourced coffee, etc. So how do we actually communicate this? Well, we're taking different parts of this to communicate the information to consumers in a different way that's relevant for the specific country. In Germany, for example, we're communicating about ageing trees, plant diseases, declining yields, volatile prices, and climate change are just some of the threats to the livelihoods of coffee farmers, the vast majority of whom are smallholders. To ensure great coffee for tomorrow, Nescafé grows and distributes 220 million young coffee plantlets to coffee farmers under 2020. So for Germany, we're really communicating around the global plan to farmers. In France, there's much more knowledge about life cycle assessment. So in France, we can actually much more communicate results from life cycle assessment, which of course we're doing very regularly. So we're communicating around greenhouse gas emissions, freshwater consumption and land use. It's an interactive tool that consumers can look at impacts across the value chain, and then translating it to easy to understand equivalents of impacts, so distance cars have driven and stuff like that, so that you can relate some of these numbers to real things that consumers can understand. In terms of using different types of media, one of the approaches we're using is through 2D barcodes on the pack. Packs are getting so cluttered with all kinds of information on it that we use quite a lot of these 2D barcodes that can take the interested consumer to a website to find out more information. So in France, again, this is linked to the life cycle assessment. You've got information on water, on greenhouse gas emissions. And this is one of the means that we're using, but it has to be in combination with others. So you've got this approach of 2D barcodes, but then approach to social media, and then also approaches through TV ads. And TV ads are still a very important part of boosting the other means of communication. Then in Switzerland, again, talking about engaging with farmers and the number of farmers that have been trained, but bringing it to also to locally in Switzerland. Our coffee factory in Switzerland is in Orb, which is about 100 kilometres away from here, where coffee beans are transformed and packed through sustainable production methods in a factory where 1/3 of the steam needs is sourced through coffee grounds. So we're using the spent coffee grounds as a renewable energy source. UK, 3 axes of communication: zero waste to landfill, better agricultural practices, particularly linked to Colombia. The Nescafe Gold Blend for the UK is mostly sourced from Colombia, and then better crops in terms of the plantlets being supplied into Colombia. This was another communication campaign where we launched a new compact refill packaging concept, and there was the communication that they chose was just 50% fewer lorries. So again, not a lot of complex LCA, although it was grounded in that, but the consumers can really easily understand 50% less lorries on the road. And then when we go to Spain, in Spain it's again about the global programme of distributing 220 million plantlets to coffee farmers. In El Salvador, now we're looking at what we're actually doing within El Salvador, so concentrating on the coffee farmers in El Salvador. So Nestle will deliver 250,000 coffee plantlets in that country, contributing to helping local coffee farmers. So the slogan is enjoy coffee, you grow, a coffee plantlet grows, and El Salvador grows. So information relevant for that particular country, and it's similar in Colombia. This coffee is inspired by the passion of thousands of Colombian coffee farmers that harvest it responsibly with their hands. Then in Sweden, we're communicating more around the partnership with Rainforest Alliance and the certification. And this is Nestle Professional, so this is our business-to-business area, where this is being done through posters, coffee that touches lives, and again, information about the coffee farmers and nurturing a brighter future for coffee farmers. So just in these few minutes, I've tried to illustrate, with a programme that is launched on a lot of very strong activities on the ground, both with coffee farmers, in our research and development organisation, and in our factories. We're choosing parts of that to communicate at any one time to consumers, because you can't tell the whole story all at once. It's just too much. So I think overall these guidelines are very good, but our message is you can't do all of it at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Let's switch to the NGO angle. Martina from WWF.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I would like to give a short introduction, a little bit how maybe we are already trying to link the two programs, the Consumer Information Program and the Food System Program. For WWF, food is, and I'm really happy about this, is one of the 6 large overall programs which we started right now. So food will be one of the priorities of WWF International for the next years. And in this context, we also have decided that WWF is co-lead in the food system program. Okay, yeah. And I think this is something I would like to start with my presentation. It's not very long, the presentation. And that's exactly what we have to understand. And this is the linkage between what's happening on the ground, this is about the food system, and with the consumers. And what we want to do is, and what is our message also, is how we could link up so that the consumer understands what he has on his plate every day, has an impact what's happening on the ground, and the same the way around, that the producers have a better understanding what is a sustainable food system, what is sustainable agriculture. So that's a little bit, and there is a long way between, and that's the challenge if we talk about linking food system with consumer information. That's a little bit the challenge we are tackled with, and we are facing this. And in this context, in this context, we have started a project in May this year, which is running in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines, and is exactly on combining the consumer information with the food system. It's a 3-year project funded by the German Ministry for Environment through the International Climate Initiative, and it's, like you see, it's one of the activities we are, from our perspective, running under the 10YFP, and also help to communicate or to bring the 10YFP also on a broader level in Southeast Asia. And I'm always struggling, and what is important, if we talk about this linkage, I think it's really important to link it up in this triangle. So to have the government on board, to have the business on board, and to work with the consumers. And what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means if we work with the government, we would like to work with the government on low-impact agri-ecological agriculture system. This would mean that we once again link it up to the climate agreements, to the Paris Agreement. So what we are working with the 3 governments in the 3 countries is to develop the national determined contribution. This means what kind of agriculture do we need to reduce greenhouse gases. In Indonesia, we're working on palm oil. In Thailand, it's especially on corn, because maize, is one of the major drivers for land use change and deforestation. And in the Philippines, the focus is on food waste, so we're working with companies, with the government, to implement or to work on how to reduce food waste, especially in hotel and restaurant. The second one then is the businesses, and if we work with businesses, we are not working with the producer on the ground in this project. We are working with the retailers, with the brands, for bringing the products into the market. So that's once again has to do with sustainable production, but also it has to do with communication, with exchange. So we are going to establish dialogue forum in the 3 countries on specific topics and on agriculture production, with the target to have more sustainable produced commodities products at the very end of the day. And the third angle, or the third part, is then once again the consumers, and that's a little bit the challenge. So we would like to work on consumer information, to make consumer understand what is really a sustainable produced product, and at the same time, and that's the iterative process, we need the companies to bring the right products into the market. So if we, for example, say we would like to have only sustainable produced palm oil, we also need companies who are offering the product so that the consumers could make the right choice. Yeah, and I would, and some examples how this could look like, or what we think is important. Maybe one step is, if we talk about consumers, we're also considering, for example, smallholders as the consumers. So we think it's very important that we have really best practice on the ground, that we work with smallholders, with small farmers, make them understand or help them for better agriculture practice, but also work on it's a kind of hidden consumer information, because the smallholders also are consuming their products on the ground. So that's one part. So in all these 3 countries, this is, by the way, an example from Zambia, but we are doing these projects on the ground also in all the 3 countries. The second important thing is also that we connect what we do with consumer information with research, with studies, easy to read for consumer. And I think, by the way, this is a challenge for the sustainable standard map. If consumers are really able to use the standard map, or if this is only a tool, let's for the business and the industry. That's just one of the questions I had. And having studies, it's conference, it's outreach, so it's really to present results, to also show what could happen on the ground. And one of the strengths of WWF are consumer campaigns. We are running campaigns in Germany, in Europe, but also like here from Indonesia, and it is an example also from Brazil, where our teams are working on reduction of food waste. So, and campaigns nowadays are very successful by using Facebook, Twitter, and all the social media. And the Indonesian campaign, the Belly Young Bike, I'm sure that I have spelled it wrong, pronounced it wrong. It's a campaign on using more sustainable palm oil, so that the producers, the consumers are really aware where their palm oil coming from, what are the impact of the palm oil. And it's an ongoing campaign which our teams have started last year. And finally, some examples also, which are also from Southeast Asia. One is on climate change. This is the Earth Hour, but we are also working in Indonesia with organic farmers. So there is this kind of community engagement, and what's very interesting for us and for our teams on the ground, that this is an increasing request also, especially in these countries, to get more information and really to build the bridge between information and sustainable food system. So, and that's my last slide, a little bit also what we have learned. I think one thing is really to strengthen knowledge about food system, to be more aware what is on our plate, what are the impact, and to understand how everybody could make changes which have then impact on the ground. The second thing, and I think that also was very encouraging, was some exercises we had or conferences in Southeast Asia with students and young people. I think this is really something we should have a stronger focus on. And it's a problem even in Germany, that a lot of young people are leaving school and don't know how to cook an egg, let's say it like this. But I think it's also something getting more and more aware in these kind of countries. And recently, I think we should be innovative, we should be creative, maybe work with chefs on food waste combined with agro-biodiversity food. So there are a lot of nice ideas running around to extend and really to make it happen on the ground. I think that was my presentation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple more examples. Marina, you're up next.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation to be here. I will be speaking now about the Sustainable Rice Platform, which is another initiative of the Sustainable Food Systems Program of the 10YFP. And I will be very quick. Just want to say why we are working with rice, just to give a bit of the context what is this initiative that we have created on rice, and what are the benefits to be part of the 10YFP. So just to start, rice is a very important crop for our population nowadays in terms of food security and food nutrition. Imagine that almost half of our population eats rice every day. It's the staple food of 3.5 billion consumers, and indeed I am Brazilian and I cannot survive without rice, but this is mainly produced and consumed in Asia, and I will speak more about that. And rice is also the main income source for 160 million, mainly poor farmers. So as we all know, there is a concern about the population growth and how you're going to produce more food for these let's say newcomers, but how we're going to do it in a more sustainable way, because we need to increase resource efficiency. And indeed, when you see in this graph, you see that rice actually has a big environmental impact in comparison to other commodities. So this is bringing two aspects: greenhouse gas emissions and water consumption. And well, we need, of course, that we need to promote sustainability in rice. And rice has a particularity, as I was mentioning in the beginning, because rice is actually a south traded commodity. So it's not different than the case of Nestlé, who is working with cafe to export. Actually, rice is basically produced and consumed in the South Hemisphere. So when we work with rice, we need a more holistic approach and look for alternative ways to really promote the adoption of sustainable practice. One way can be consumed, of course, but you need to also look at other alternatives. So then it comes also the 10YFP program, and I will speak about that later. So yeah, so we need, the challenges are big. We need incentives, we need to look at support programs. We need also a reference on sustainable rice cultivation. And this cannot be done without cooperation, collaboration in such a complex issue. So then it comes the idea of the Sustainable Rice Platform. And this was an initiative created by UN Environment and IRI. IRI is the International Rice Research Institute. It was created in 2011, really with this idea of bringing together different actors of the rice value chain to drive impact, to create, to promote resource efficiency in rice. So nowadays there are 70 members, and we are always welcoming more members. Whoever is interested to work with rice as a staple food, to join the group. And this is a bit of the approach of the Sustainable Rice Platform. So on one hand, there is a work on supply chain sustainability, so trying to transform the market, but we also need to work with public sector engagement, so really trying to create these enabling conditions for the adoption of sustainable practice in rice. So there are 3 working groups, and the members can be part of these working groups. And besides that, there are some activities that we take together with the members, such as creative guidance. We also promote national roundtables at country levels, and capacity building. A lot of training, because this is very important. So the working group 3, for instance, worked on the development of the first global rice sustainability standard. This was actually launched in 2015, and this standard is also accompanied by indicators to measure impact, to measure progress, and it covers 8 teams and 46 requirements. The idea was to come with something very practical, and it's already available in 12 languages. So you can go in the website and find the standards and indicators over there. So just very quickly, the evolution before I finish. So yeah, so the development of the standard, had a process, of many consultations, so it took 3 years. And then in 2015, the standard was launched. And after the standard was launched, we started testing the standard on the ground in different countries, mainly in Asia. This is mainly done over there. And now it's the phase that we are calling upscaling of the standard. So basically what they did, and this was actually done by IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, because they have a group of researchers over there. They started collecting the data from this testing, and they prepared a second version of the standard, which is now actually available for public consultation. So from the 15th of September until the 15th of November, the standard version 2 is available in our website for public consultation, so I would like to welcome to go there and to comment. And this is following actually ICU Alliance best practice, code of best practice. And well, so this is the upscaling, so it's about the revision of the standard and also a discussion about an assurance framework, because there are some companies that are interested actually to claim and to claim the sustainable practice. And now, just to finalize, I will speak about the Sustainable Food Systems Program of the 10YFP. So the SRP decided to be part of the Sustainable Food Systems Program of the 10YFP. And the way that this program works, it's about a global network. So it's a global network that brings together different partners, different initiatives that aim to support the transition to sustainable food system. So we thought that SRP also has this goal, and it would be advantage values for us to be part of the 10YFP. So we first registered the initiative as an affiliated initiative. So when you register your initiative there, you are already exposed to this network, and you can also disclose information about your project, and you start also sharing the lessons learned. But for us, I think the main thing, given the challenge of rice, to be part of the 10YFP is good, because we can actually start working with other institutions that are discussing incentives for the adoption of sustainable practice, and we can share experiences, lessons learned. So this is very beneficial. So I think Ian mentioned about the themes of the Sustainable Food Systems Program, and one of them is about working with sustainability in the value chain. So the SRP is taking a lot of advantage of this discussion, and that's the idea of upscaling through the 10YFP. So yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Marina, and nice link to Joshua from ICIL to speak. Join us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ian and Charlie, for the invitation. I'm Joshua Wickerham, the Policy and Outreach Manager at the ICIL Alliance. We are a part of the Consumer Information Program, MAC, and I'm going to share some experiences about that. We're also part of the Sustainable Public Procurement part of the 10YFP, the working group. I'm going to share also some food for thought on how governments can be good partners working with sustainability standards to achieve the SDGs, both on the production and on the consumption side. So ICIL and WWF recently released a report on how standards can help reach the SDGs. And it's interesting, in the framework of the SDGs, there's kind of a gap in the consuming countries about all the aspects of trade. With 80% of trade in global value chains, sustainability standards can measure a lot of the sustainability value add in the complex global value chains. And sustainability standards generally, based on a meta review of business benefits, are in three categories. There are efficiency gains, transparency and traceability gains, and improved supply chain relations. So we believe that relevant, high-performing sustainability standards can be one means of channeling resources to achieve the SDGs. Most of you probably know ICIL. We're the Global Association of Sustainability Standards. We work to improve the practices of sustainability standards to improve impacts socially, and environmentally, and economically. ICIL's members, many of which we've talked about today, which many of you recognize. ICIL's members have a system behind the standard to make sure that there's a strong standard-setting practice built based on consensus, that capacity is built, that there's a strong independent verification or certification mechanism, and often a label for consumers or for other users of standards. Based on this SDG report, another way of looking at this is that sustainability standards can be matched up to different aspects of the SDGs. So the standard is developed through a multi-stakeholder process. The implementation of the standard leads to more sustainable practices, leading to progress on the SDGs, as long as the standard is a credible, impactful standard that's implemented properly. And then there's an independent verification. And then markets, consumers, governments prefer standards, and there are impacts on, from the finance sector, from public policies, buyers, retailers, consumers. I'm going to focus more on the public policies and the roles of governments. ICL membership is based on adherence to codes of good practice. Recently, ICL asked a prominent trade law firm, a law firm focused with a strong trade practice, to compare ICL's membership requirements to WTO principles and disciplines. And they found a strong overlap between ICL's requirements and what's expected at the WTO. And they said there's a very low risk for governments to recommend the use of ICL membership within their jurisdictions as a reasonable measure under the TBT agreement. So a government could recommend that standards adhere to ICL's codes of good practice. Based on the ICL codes of good practice, ICL developed 5 years ago 10 credibility principles that allow governments and businesses a sort of at-a-glance way to understand what's credible practice for sustainability standards. These credibility principles are up for revision next year. ICL revises all of its codes every 5 years. We welcome your feedback and involvement, especially from a government perspective. Another thing to consider would be what are the 50 must-haves for a sustainability standard to be developed in a national context, a local context, or for a government to engage with that sustainability standard. Because governments, when they engage with a standard, they make an implicit decision about the credibility of that standard. But what are the sort of key aspects of a credible standard that governments should consider before engaging and using the standard in public policy? So we're interested in partnerships and exploring that realm. Based on ITC's report last year, ICL membership is strongly linked to better transparency about the system. ICL members are 44% more likely to openly provide development procedures on their standards, 52% more likely to provide information about dispute or complaint and resolution systems, 34% more likely to provide information on how to get certified or verified. Another issue is accessibility, and the report found that ICL members are 20% more likely to offer some sort of additional financial mechanism to reach certification, 34% more likely to offer some means of learning and assistance to producers. We'd like to see all of this increase. ICL is constantly working to better improve accessibility and transparency and other aspects of its members and other standards we work with. We got involved in the consumer information guidelines because 3 years ago ICL developed a campaign on what are credible claims that sustainability standards should make, and we wanted to engage businesses, consumers, governments, etc. with this Challenge the Label campaign. And you can find that at iclalliance.org/challenge. And we said the first step is to ask the right questions based on what does the claim cover, what type of claim is being made, what sustainability attributes does the claim cover, and how is the claim verified. And with a credible claim, all these should be easy to determine. The second step is to assess the credibility of the claim. These are based on ICL's credibility principles. The claim should be clear, should be accurate, should be relevant, and it's based on a system that's transparent and robust. And so by engaging with the 10YFP Consumer Information Program, we've been able to take many of these principles to new audiences, get more feedback, take this work into new areas beyond just claims made by sustainability standard systems. Now on to areas where governments can play increasing are playing increasing roles. I've got governments are using sustainability standards more and more in their policies. In public procurement, there's a lot of use. Certification of public bodies or assets is also growing. Incentives to encourage industry uptake. Referencing credible standards in guidance or legislation, recognizing entire regions as standards compliant, so jurisdictional or regional approaches, favoring certified products in government purchases, or step approaches, so based on maybe a local or national standard and working toward maybe a stronger, higher impact international standard. Some specific cases about partnerships in practice. In Suriname, the government supported an assessment of a species called a sea bob. It's a little shrimp. And in order to get MSC certified, you have to have an assessment of how many species are in the ecosystem. So the government funded this work, and it's the first tropical Marine Stewardship Council certified site. The EU Renewable Energy Directive was recently revised. It's improving its principles and its implementation, more of a focus on transparency. In Mozambique, the Industry Association with government support developed a national standard that now has mutual recognition with the Better Cotton Initiative. So you develop local ownership, you work with the government to increase capacity, and then you work with Better Cotton Initiative to ensure that big global buyers like H&M and others are buying that cotton from Mozambique. In Indonesia and Malaysia, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil is also piloting jurisdictional approaches, working to meet MSPO or ISPO and then work up to RSPO. In Minas Gerais in Brazil, Certifica Minas, the state-developed certification for coffee, now has a collaboration with UTZ to recognize the local standard and help it meet international markets requirements. And of course, we're big supporters of the work of ITC in developing a common language for standards with Sustainability Map. And so if we take the premise that certain so-called private standards are actually meeting WTO requirements, governments have perhaps certain more leeway to utilize sustainability standards in policies. So how can we co-regulate and develop partnerships so that producers can move up the ladder of sustainability? There are carrots and there are sticks. On the carrot side, on the incentives, if a good or service meets a credible sustainability standard, a government could work to enhance the trade facilitation based on perhaps the trade facilitation agreement that was signed this year. Link implementation of a standard to aid for trade. Use it as the basis for subsidies. Use it as the basis for a general system of preferences. Usually a general system of preferences is based on a national assessment, but there's no reason it couldn't be based on a sectoral assessment or even individual company assessment. Standards are also being used increasingly as the basis for bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements. The WTO looks less happily on tariffs or taxes or screening, but there is potential to explore more of these sticks as well. And just final thoughts on partnering for success. Credible, emphasis on credible sustainability standards can be partners for the government, for governments, both on producing and consuming sides to achieve the SDGs. But more incentives and partnerships are needed to scale up sustainability impacts. And governments are key to that enabling environment. And we hope that 10YFP can be part of that partnership. And we're help us work more with governments. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. Last but not least, we asked Joe at the end of his 2 long days to give a few thoughts from ITC's perspective, and perhaps that can also already try and think about Martina's point about how Standards Map could be used, what people like us might need to do to help apply that to more consumer actors.
Yes. So thanks, Ian, and thank you, Charlie and Beatrice, for the invitation to speak this afternoon. So I just wanted to provide some reflections on why ITC, why T4SD has been involved, to date with the Consumer Information Program, how that relates to our mandate, what are the kind of lessons learned, and also to reflect on Martina's question in terms of standards map. So as Arantxa Gonzalez mentioned yesterday when she introduced President Humbo of IFAD, the SDG 12, especially on the consumption angle, has been undersubscribed. And while it's not an obvious, let's say, issue for us at ITC, given the fact that we're a trade agency and our main beneficiary or stakeholder is, let's say, the producing SME at origin, obviously when you're dealing with issues of sustainable development, you need to look at both sides of the coin. You can't look at just the production side or the origin. You have to also look at the consumption side, the consumer side, which obviously has a pull in terms of increasing demand, not only in developed economies, but also increasingly in the emerging markets. So when T4SD began 9 years ago, obviously we weren't even looking at the consumer side. I mean, we didn't even think about it. We were really focused solely on how do we deliver a product, a tool to enable transparency and to enable producers, exporters, trade support institutions, policymakers to find more transparency and information on these voluntary sustainability standards. But things change over time, and as we matured as a program, we realized that the tools that we've developed, especially the IT tools that you saw, for example, when Greg presented Sustainability Map this afternoon, obviously a website, a web tool, is not meant for just one user. Anyone can access that web tool, anyone can take advantage of the data and the information and the intelligence that are in that tool. And so we see it also as an opportunity to leverage what we've developed for the consumer side. And also when 10YFP came to us and said, look, do you want to participate in the CIP? We thought it was a very good opportunity, not only to leverage the experience we have had with developing the T4SD database, working with now about 240 voluntary or private standards, to understand, as Joshua was mentioning, okay, what are sustainability standard claims? How are they codified, or how are they described and articulated in the standard, which can all be found on the standards map system, on the processes side of the database. How do we leverage that and use that knowledge and experience to the benefit of the consumer information guidelines? So that was kind of the baseline. But also for us, it's been a learning experience, because we want to understand how we can in the future, I mean, not today, we're not at that point yet, but how in the future we can leverage our tools to also inform consumers. Because as Martina mentioned, I mean, right now, and as you've seen from Greg's demo this afternoon, it is a very complicated tool. It's a very complicated system in general, but also the standards are not, if you will, let's say, quite accessible in my view to consumers. I mean, consumers have shorter attention spans. They're not experts like we are in this room on the various nuances and details of these standards. So what we wanted to also understand is how do we put together a common baseline to look at guidelines for consumers? How do we then articulate that into a concrete vision, and down the road perhaps leverage our tools and programs at ITC, and specifically with T4SD, to engage in the consumer side. So for us, it's a journey. We're indeed just embarking on that. I do think there's a lot that we need to learn in terms of how we approach the consumer side, but I think this is an indication. And just to kind of go beyond the CIP in terms of other 10YFP work streams, whether it is sustainable public procurement, whether it is sustainable food systems, I think again we're willing and very indeed excited to actually work with UN Environment to leverage the tools. So how can we, on the value chain side, especially with the sustainable food system stream, how can we leverage the network that we have on the sustainability map to really give more of a voice, a bottom-up approach to the producers that are engaging in sustainable production, and then communicate those achievements and the realities of that journey to consumers, much as Nestle has, for example, in their product offerings in the various country cases that were shown today. So thanks again for the opportunity, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, in fact, if you can clap all of the panelists back to the stage, and then you can start raising your hands for questions. I think I've heard a few examples there. There must be quite a few questions as well, or challenges even to, there's some talk. What can we do? Yes, please. I'll run around with the. And if you can say who you are.
Again, Andreas Stamm from the German Development Institute. I have one question that might bring some energy back to this late afternoon session. It goes to Anne Rolin from Nestle. First of all, I want to stress that I think it's very crucial that big business goes into these kind of initiatives. So I'm very happy with it. And I've worked on it in the past. I have one question, or two questions, that is not new to you, I think. One is, if Nestle is committed to sustainability issues, first, why does Nestle not join the fair trade coffee sector? It's one of the big companies. Maybe that you are not convinced of the standard, but a representative of one of your competing companies said to me, if we label part of our coffees with a fair trade label, it might imply that our other coffees come from unfair fair trade practices. So it's a marketing problem. This is one of the questions. The other question would be, why don't you press for phasing out the Nespresso program within the company? Nespresso being the environmentally least sustainable form of delivering coffee. Thank you.
Could I add one more question? Sorry, I would like to take the chance, because my question is, what I didn't see is, how do you tackle the whole problem with climate change, so that the farmers maybe have to go to other areas, and this could become a problem for biodiversity or for land use change, deforestation. That I didn't find it on your presentation.
In 10 minutes it's a short. Okay, so why not join the fair trade? Well, we are focusing our efforts on working directly on the ground with farmers through our agronomists, through our program, as I showed, of breeding and delivering plantlets, and we really prefer to focus our efforts on that. We're certainly not against certification. It's done a lot of good things, but we really prefer to work directly with the farmers. We are buying directly from 800,000 smallholder farmers in coffee, cocoa and dairy, and we prefer to focus our efforts there. Nespresso are doing a huge amount in this space. I could have taken them as an example, maybe it might have been even better. So Nespresso is unsustainable. I don't think that's correct. Life cycle assessment indicates that. Of course, it always depends exactly what you're comparing it with. But we certainly don't believe that Nespresso is unsustainable. They do a huge amount in terms of on-the-ground work in countries where I think there's almost no other company from the private sector working. You can take the example of South Sudan, where we're working to rebuild the coffee industry there. And there's a video on YouTube you can look at to see what is actually happening there. So we're working in difficult countries to rebuild and strengthen the coffee industry. Climate change is a big problem for tropical crops, obviously, for coffee and cocoa, which only grow in a certain belt. So that is a big part of our breeding program, which is done in our Research and Development Centre in Tours in France, and in the Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, is related to breeding more climate-resistant crops, varieties, through developing the rootstock to make more stable roots that are more drought resistant, etc., more resistant to higher temperatures. And we're working in a number of other collaborative programs like Cocoa Action to work with our competitors like Mars and other companies pre-competitively to really try to tackle this important problem together.
Any other questions for anyone, not just Anne?
Hi, my name is Arpit Bodani. I represent the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Just a question to the colleague from ICEAL. You mentioned that a lot of governments are using this for government procurement, a lot of VSS. Could you give some examples? It would be very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. For example, the UK set up a public procurement centre on timber. A lot of the Chinese government has public procurement requirements for its state-owned enterprises. If wood is imported and it has FSC or PEFC certification, it will have more points added to the life cycle assessment. A lot of the public procurement is based on life cycle assessment or eco-labels, but also sustainability standards increasingly. So timber is really leading, but we can talk afterward. I could share more examples.
My name is Thomas Burnett, Research Institute of Organic Agriculture. In organic market development, there are two very important players that have access to consumers. One are the retailers. Obviously, they also have their own interests, and then we have also public television, radio. Especially here in Switzerland, they are actually doing quite a good job, especially related to food waste. So I wonder if these two actors play a role in reaching out to the consumers who really are the drivers at the end for more sustainability related to consumption and production.
I'd like to share another Chinese example. The China Franchise and Chain Store Association works with all the major retailers in China to promote awareness of FSC, MSC, RSPO, and they're also working with the 10YFP project on guidelines in the Chinese context of communicating with consumers on sustainability issues.
Yeah, on the organic question, I mean, I think time will tell. I mean, one of the most interesting developments in the recent months is Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods in the U.S. So, I mean, typically organic is quite niche, if you will, and I've heard in other fora you can't feed the world on organic, but when you have Amazon coming to the table here and actually acquiring Whole Foods, reducing by 20% in some cases, according to news reports of food sold in Whole Foods shopping in stores in the States, there is, and also when you compound that with the online shopping, which down the road for food could be huge in the States, in North America, there could be a huge opportunity for upscaling a volume of organic. The question, and that could be great from a consumer perspective because there'll be obviously more of a, let's say, mass understanding of organic and sustainability issues, but then the challenge is how do you keep up on the organic side with that consumer demand that could explode in North America and the US and elsewhere.
Yeah, maybe to add something, I think this is really something we have to consider, how we could use all this online shopping to bring a more sustainable and organic product on the market. For example, in Indonesia it's the same. More and more people are using these delivering services, and this is very interesting. And when I talk about innovation, how could we step in as a community who would like to have a more sustainable produced products and bring it to the market, and maybe especially this kind of delivery service could be a great opportunity, which we have to think through how to link it up.
Okay, I think there was a hand up over here.
Just a quick question. I was interested in ICEAL's reference to the jurisdictional approach or more landscape level. Is this a new initiative in which the government of the producing countries are also involved, and what does it entail exactly? Thank you.
Yeah, ICEAL's written a report about a year ago on jurisdictional approaches, which you might want to check out. But in the Indonesian and Malaysian contexts with Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, it is largely driven by the local government actors, the governors of the regions.
that have reached out to RSPO or vice versa, and yeah, they're putting a lot of resources into building up producer capacity. I also see that in tea growing regions in China, where local governments are happy to get an international certification, whereas the central government may have more questions about it. The local government's there to provide capacity.
This is a question to all the panelists. I haven't heard anything about reducing the impact of transport, which is definitely a big issue. I mean, an apple from New Zealand can be as organically produced as it wants. It will never be will never make sense from the environmental perspective to consume apples from New Zealand here. What are the what kind of ideas do you have to reduce transport in the value chain?
Sourcing as locally as possible. And the comments earlier about online shopping and home delivery, I'm not sure that that is really the ultimate sustainable solution, given all the additional transport on the roads. So the environmental impact of transportation depends enormously on the type of transport. Sea transport really does not have a very high environmental impact. When as soon as you get on trucks on the road, it shoots up. So it depends from where and what type of transport. But our aim is to source as locally as possible. Of our 450 factories around the world, the vast majority are in rural areas and sourcing local materials.
Well, yeah, information is a very powerful tool, and the companies should use this tool responsibly. This is the fundamental, the rationale behind the guidelines. And so, to address your comment, to change the consumer's behavior, the information is needed. And I think that it will come a time where this information is so broadly spread that about the transport and that will actually push the consumer to choose like locally produced, regional produced goods. I don't think that we are in that, at that time yet. But I think that we should all keep in mind, and I will take advantage of Anja's Van Moot comment this morning, and also I see a report on the SDGs, that standards are only instrumental to a higher goal, which is to produce and to consume more sustainably. So I think that your question is very timely put, because we have been discussing many technical issues today, but very few on how or what are we going to achieve in terms of impacts.
I mean, you are of course absolutely right. Transport of all goods which are moved, whether they're a short distance or a long distance, and how they're moved, are a part of the impact of the supply chain. However, the fact remains, whilst we've gone a long way in life cycle approaches and life cycle assessments, the issue of the transport and the impact of the transport and the greenhouse gas emissions from it is something that very few people are actually measuring. There was also a kind of a false start on the whole transport issue with the issue of food miles, which you may have heard of, which was a question of your food has less of an impact if it travels less far, and it was too simplistic. It wasn't a comprehensive life cycle assessment. The environmental footprint of any item of food that you ultimately consume is a combination of all the things that have contributed to producing it and getting it from where it started to your mouth. And I think there were a number of people who got burned in terms of the advocacy groups that picked up the Food Miles campaign, and there were a lot of developing country producers who were furious about this because it essentially discriminated against them if you just picked out food miles as the footprint of food. So we do need to look at this, but we need to have a comprehensive approach, and we do need to take into account its impact on trade, because if you touch the third rail of trade, with your particular approach, you can find yourself in quite a lot of trouble. Joe doesn't want to say anything more.
That was exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I was just going to more or less echo what Charlie said, but also a few years ago, ITC did my colleague Alex Castrin wrote a paper on the food miles debate, so that is available on the ITC website. I mean, the findings more or less were that, look, for most products that you're talking about, the major, let's say, CO2 or environmental impact is at the retailer point of view, so at the store where the food is in the shelf, under refrigeration, or in the car from the store to the house, and then in the refrigerator or the freezer of that house. And so that's where the CO2 impact is clustering. Now, obviously, there are specific products that may, bust that model. But in terms of the work that we did at ITC several years ago, that was the findings. But it's a Food Miles debate publication that our environment group did, and happy to help you source that if you need.
I think a linked comment here.
Yeah, a very linked comment. Just to add a different dimension to this discussion, I think it's very important to talk about what is the impact on climate change, of course. But I guess we all know that one of the big challenges of the SDGs is that there will be a trade-off between the SDGs. And when it comes to exports, we have to be extremely careful in not putting so much attention on climate only, environmental impact only, and dismiss what is happening in terms of poverty reduction. So I don't want to buy or not buy organic bananas or bananas in general from Peru just because they may have a slightly higher greenhouse gases emissions. Why? Because of the impact of those bananas in terms of poverty reduction in specific areas of Peru. So just, again, I mean, it's not to enter into controversial discussions, but let's not focus only on one specific dimension of sustainability, because I think one of the issues that we're facing in our sustainability standards is they are not necessarily addressing what is the impact on poverty reduction. So transport, fine, I agree. Air freight and maritime transportation is completely different. But more important than that is why are we importing and what is the contribution that we're doing to society in general.
Any responses, or I'll move around to the back.
Hi, thanks. It's Hamish Taylor. I'll make this point personally rather than on behalf of any company, because Charlie mentioned the third rail of trade. How about the overhead tension wires of the activists and the investigative journalists? Do you think that one of the positive side effects of companies actually conforming to a decent code of conduct about consumer information and sustainability might mean that we'll have less distractions of the sensationalist headlines of the activists and the so-called investigative journalists?
I just wanted to ask if Eliza wanted to answer that question.
One second.
If consumer companies actually improve the way that they communicate sustainability with integrity to consumers, will we actually see the media and the activists actually also show some integrity as opposed to just going for sensationalist headlines?
Do you want me to bring the microphone over slowly to give you a second to think?
I really hate being the voice. Everyone, I was just minding my own business. God, there's so much there, and perhaps I was thinking and listening to the conversation and had so many questions, and then thought perhaps some of them are on a one-to-one, because the complicity between the media and corporations, it's not something that it's how do I say this without taking up all your evenings? Okay. The short answer is, I think, having worked for, I used to work for the Pesticide Action Network. We used to try and get brands to talk about their use of organic cotton for reasons that people have already mentioned. Companies were saying, well, if we point out the 3%, the media and activists are going to lambast us for the 97% that isn't organic or fair trade or whatever. And the media's job is to be cynical of claims so as to sort of look behind what is being said, what we get as in press releases, etc., to try and get at a deeper truth. Where that complicity becomes unproductive for consumers is not something we can arrive at here very easily, because there isn't anymore, as media companies are also corporations that need to survive, a clear distinction. So I don't have a short and satisfactory answer for you. I don't necessarily think that media sensationalism when it comes to sustainability is most of the media, and you know, I'm sorry, I can't really. It's something that we need to have a conversation about rather than a really easy answer, because I think that media complicity in these issues, and when we talk about the root causes, it's not something that I could sort of, it would be very much like the media you're complaining about if I was to trot out a headline. That kind of gives you a nice, easy answer, because life is complex, and what you're asking is for the media to give you a nice, easy answer that you prefer to see rather than one that you don't. So, well, exactly, or in life, but yet you know. So it's something that deserves, I think, perhaps a discussion about the relationship with the work that we're doing here and the media or in communications, if we were to get into that, because there aren't 140 character tropes that I could provide for you, unfortunately.
If I could just have a go, as I volunteered Elisa.
You did.
Sorry about that. I don't think certification of sustainability standards will remove the scourge of sensationalist journalism from this world, Hamish, and you know it won't. It'll still be there. I think what transparency and standards, and particularly third-party certification, does is mean that those companies that are actually trying will be left alone to try, so long as they're frank. It's about, you know, it's about transparency. Supposedly investigative journalism is about shining a light. What standards and third-party certification is about, a willingness to shine the light on your whole operation, your full operation. They will then leave you alone. What it does mean is that the scourge of investigative journalism will be focused much better on the bad guys if the good guys and girls certify themselves. So that is some kind of an answer, but don't, you know, certification standards is not a silver bullet for anything, and you know, we can't expect it to fix everything. But you know, I know from my experience working for NGOs before I worked for UN Environment, the simple, most important thing we sometimes do is shine a light. So we need that. Any company that volunteers, or any group of companies or producer that volunteers to do that, deserves the credit for it, and they do deserve to be left alone afterwards if they're trying their best.
Maybe I can just make a quick one. I doubt whether it's likely to decrease, because these type of journalists and organisations, they're just looking for that. And some of the issues, particularly in social sustainability, are so deep that they take a really long time to fix. I mean, if you look at child labour in the cocoa supply chain, I mean, it's going to be years and years of work to address that. And this is, you know, what we're trying to do in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. But any journalist can come along and, you know, find cases of it. And you find cases of child labour in certified cocoa plantations as well. So, you know, the bigger you are, the more you're exposed. So I doubt whether they're going to leave us alone, honestly, whatever we do.
Okay, after what I think was a very transparent answer, I think some feedback.
Yes, may I offer something perhaps a bit more coherent now, since I wasn't really listening closely before I got asked. Okay, so it is not the job of the media, nor is it the job of civil society to ever leave you alone. our role is to be consistently looking so that you are consistently improving. If you have, what I meant by complicity is that I have far too often, as a desk editor covering global development, received headlines for pilot projects or things that are not going to either A, be sustainable, or B, have a long-term impact, C, involve the community, D, look anything like empowering, being offered as a silver bullet, as a solution. And I think organizations, companies, not exclusively, but definitely the sort of trend of just talking about your successes as existing outside of a complex world and of a complex reality. Nobody, again with the example of organic cotton, nobody talked about the fact that it takes 3 years to convert from traditional to organic, that even if all the supply today, or whatever, all the fields of organic cotton were meeting, that basically that supply was never going to, or was not going to meet demand. None of these complex things are presented to journalists when everyone is talking about the wonderful things that they're doing, and so the public don't understand. And so a journalist in one article with an editor who has a short sort of commitment or attention span, if you want, to this issue, who is on the news cycle and not necessarily committed to reporting sustainability. There are very few desks with, and this is what I meant by the sort of media companies being corporations themselves. There's very little money in journalism, so not very many desks have dedicated platforms to talking about these sorts of issues. So when you are competing against the news cycle, and you present more often than not something that seems to be a panacea, any journalist worth their salt looking at it will say it isn't. And if they shine a light on it today, they might not next year on International Fair Trade Day or whatever it is. So your job is to keep doing what you're doing and pressing for improvements in standards and sustainability, perhaps because you believe in sustainability. And a journalist such as myself, my job is to keep asking you how much progress you're making towards those targets. And my commitment is to not skew what you're saying, but it's also to expect from you something more substantive than we are now, this is a bad press release. Nespresso is working in South Sudan, so we are basically the best thing to have happened to South Sudan because they have war, and and I have received press releases not too dissimilar from that. Now, as a good journalist, if I'm looking at the complexity of what's going on in South Sudan, I can say your coffee program is great, but given the entire scale of what is happening in South Sudan, is not probably going to solve South Sudan's problems. So, am I being unfair to you, or am I doing my job to say that this sits within a wider world of complex challenges? And so, yeah, I only came back to it because there is never any point at which a journalist should leave anyone who exercises influence and power over society alone because they're making advances in the right direction. We should commend those advances, but see them within the wider scope of the problems and also of the root causes. So if you give with one hand and you're taking back with the other, it's also my job to call that out.
Okay, I'm sure these can run into the bars of Geneva as well. I saw a couple more hands up as well.
Yeah, I fear I'm being a joy kill because I'm going to make a comment on public procurement, which is not as exciting. Johannes Luderich, working for GIZ, and we are also implementing projects for the German government on public procurement. So I would applaud you, first of all, for making or inviting a law firm to give a legal opinion on public procurement and how certifications can play into that. And as you probably know, there is an EU directive that allows for the use of certifications in public procurement processes, and that has been implemented on the German level as well. And what we learned in our project is that it is very important to translate the legal language of the directive to the standards and certification language and the criteria that are in there. And you said that the legal opinion of your law firm said that ISEAL membership might be something that for governments are recommended. In Germany, we have had 2 legal opinions that said that ISO 14024, so ISO type 1 eco-labels, would be something that would fulfill the needs of that EU directive. So I would just encourage, and also the standards map criteria, to always look for legal language, standards language, and to keep on working on that and do more legal opinions on that matter.
Thank you. Just following up, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also recognized ISIL membership as a criteria for government procurement. I'm not sure where that is under the new presidency, but it was tail end of the Obama administration.
Well, I really like to welcome your comment because I think this is very important. UN Environment has implemented a joint project called SPEL, which stands for Sustainable Public Procurement and Ecolabel. It's an EU-funded project. It's been implemented for 5 years now, I think, in about 8 to 10 countries. And we try to synergize both tools, the SPP from the demand side and the eco-labels from the production side. And it's very challenging. It's been challenged by the local regulations in many countries, many developing countries who have been implementing this in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and it's something that comes up very frequently that, oh no, you cannot because this will influence the competitiveness of the market. But I think it's something that it should be worked together as because one tool actually fosters the other one very highly. It's very high potential for it, and I think that we should discuss this topic further. Maybe next year in your forum, in your conference, you can bring up this topic as well.
Okay, we had one final question before ITC will wrap up the day.
Thank you, I thought you forgot. My name is Vivian Valencia, University of Michigan, and when I read sustainable food systems, one of the first things that I think about is agrobiodiversity and diverse food systems that not only feed people but nourish people. So cacao and coffee certainly make people happy but do not nourish them. And rice is an important staple, but alone does not provide all the nutrients, so people need to have diversified diets. And I also think of food systems that feed people at the local and regional scale, so not only end crops or commodities that end up in the north. So how can all these sustainability standards and platforms and efforts help build those sustainable food systems that feed people, nourish people, and that are also at a local and regional level, not only sending things to the developed world? So that is my question. Thank you.
Maybe I can partly answer this. One of my colleagues is actually leading the core initiative on biodiversity within the Sustainable Food Systems Programme. So this has got a number of axes, but including really evaluating the methods to assess biodiversity and taking approaches also around valuation and natural capital, which allow you to compare things that are difficult to compare otherwise. So that's looking at the impact of the food system on biodiversity loss. And then within the company, we've got a big program on using more diverse crops. So we've launched a whole range of products, particularly in baby foods, using organic ingredients with ancient grains and a wide variety of vegetables. We've got programs, for example, in Spain, looking at tomato production. Tomatoes is actually the biggest vegetables that we purchase, how we can use more diverse types of tomatoes, both to improve the diversity as such, but also at the same time improve taste and flavour. We've got a programme equally on biofortification, which is in collaboration with Harvest Plus, who've, together with the CGIAR centres, have developed a range of staple crops that are naturally rich in micronutrients. and we've launched this in Nigeria with vitamin A enriched maize, where we're helping to develop the supply chain in that country, with the aim of not only using it in our products, but that the smallholder farmers have a more nutritious diet because they're consuming a more nutritious form of maize. So just in a few words, those are a few examples of some of the things that we're doing.
Yeah, no, just a comment a bit from the perspective of the Sustainable Rice Platform. So one of the ways that we are addressing this is through the creation of a national roundtables, and actually one of the other projects of the Sustainable Food System Program is on governance. And I think indeed what we need today is to have a more holistic approach to reach sustainable food systems, because as Annie was mentioning, I mean, we don't realize agriculture is very much connected to health, which is much connected to education. So if we don't have this holistic approach, we'll never really reach the sustainable food system. So.
Yeah, maybe one comment, what we really have to be aware that standard certification will not, it's the right way forward, but it will not solve a lot of the problems we have on the ground. And this is, for example, the sustainable diet question, which is not really tackled in the certification schemes. It's somehow, if you talk about crop rotation, so this is something we have to tackle, but we really have to be aware that even if we talk about standard and certification, it's not the license for a good production. Yeah? As WWF, we really have worked very long on certification and standards, and now we say it's a good way forward, but it's not a carte blanche for everything which is good. And I think especially on the agrobiodiversity issue and diverse, healthy diets, this is something, from my perspective, you will never bring in a standard or certification scheme. So this is really, but this is something where it's really urgent, or it's important to in the food system to bring this in the discussion. And recently there was an initiative launched at the EAT conference. It's the Food Forever initiative, which is especially on this agrobiodiversity, which you very often forget if you talk about healthy diets. So thank you for your question.
And thanks for the smart question from someone from my alma mater. Nice to hear that. I do find chocolate nourishing, but of course nutritionally it's lacking. And one ICIL member is a leaf linking environment and farming, and in London I buy lettuce and I see the leaf logo, and it's not imported, it's grown in the UK, so it's not all developing countries exporting to developed markets. So.
I really think we do need to close now, so I'm going to ask Anders Arrow to come up. I would just say on that last question, silver bullets, there are none. You need two things really. You need a holistic systems approach, and you need a supply chain approach. And I think the 10YFP programs are all, in one sense or another, trying to apply a holistic systems of approach with multi-stakeholders, with action from governments, business, consumers and NGOs. And the programs go much wider than standards and certification in every single case. But what is clear, and I think what is clear from the standards map, all the discussions we've had over these 2 days, that standards and certification can catalyze a lot of things far more than we originally imagined, and they can actually provide a real opportunity for leadership from both governments and business and consumers who buy the product. So thank you, and if Anders would, who's been extremely patient, would kindly come up to finish, and you've got a working mic there.
So thank you very much, and good afternoon everybody. My name is Anders Arrow. I'm the Director for the Division of Enterprises and Institutions here at ITC. This institution is very important, I find, because we host this T4SD and many other initiatives. In my division, we have particular focus on activities in relation to sustainable trade for development. As we close the 4th T4SD Forum this afternoon, I would like to thank you for your participation and inputs, and we have covered a lot of ground on sustainable trade and sustainability standard issues yesterday and today. and your engagement and passion for these topics are clearly evident. Before we wrap up today, I would like to highlight some of the main takeaways from the panel discussions, particularly those that relate to the theme of partnerships. I think a good point and a good beam for us here at ICC, and hopefully also for the community, is that the SDGs are the compass which guides our work on sustainable trade and also the way we understand impact. President Hongbo of IFAD, in his keynote speech, reminded us that multi-sectoral coordinated action is indeed needed, and trust is paramount when forging sustainable and inclusive partnerships. I think it's evident to all of us in this room that the challenges faced by the world today certainly require partnerships, and that impact that is required go way beyond what individual initiatives and institutions can master. Our colleagues from BMZ indicated that while niche solutions are indeed interesting and okay, we need to be able to scale them up to mainstream. And it again alludes to that we need massive solutions to big problems. There's also been an ongoing theme that sustainability standards form a key role, can play a key role in assisting farmers transition from a survival mode of production to seeing their farms as commercial entities, from agriculture to agribusiness, so to speak. Particularly in developing countries, the implementation of sustainability standards is still more government-led and top-down. And a key challenge in this context is, therefore, how can this be shifted to make it more bottom-up and more involved with the producers? It's also been discussed that the role of international organizations like the WTO in this discussion of promoting sustainability is certainly worthwhile exploring in further detail. When it comes to supply chains that dominate so much of this world's trade, these need clearly to be more transparent in many cases. And only a tiny amount of the price increase for sustainable products actually goes to the farmers. So hence, a key challenge is also a need to prevent additional costs along the supply chain, because then there will be even less. We also know from our work in the field that sustainability standards are difficult to access for SMEs. And these SMEs are, on the other hand, becoming increasingly important players in today's value chains in the global economy. So we need, I think is a takeaway, at least for me, because of the complexity of the sustainability standards, to create solutions that are intelligible and accessible, and more one-stop platforms to make standards understandable, and incentive mechanisms to make them more affordable for SMEs. As you witnessed, earlier this afternoon we launched a sustainability map with which we aim to leverage through increased partnerships with colleagues such as yourself in this room. We hope that sustainability map can help make standards implementation more bottom-up, more transparent, and more affordable. We encourage you to take sustainability map for a test drive and let us know your feedback. Before I close, I would like to thank warmly the team, so my colleagues, who has been involved in this important event and who is also involved with the important work of the T4SD team. It's Anna and Helen who have been playing a key role in facilitating and setting up this important forum. And it's also certainly also the rest of the team under the very impressive leadership of Joe, so Matthew and Greg and Bruce and Brew, Christoph and Sandra and Regina and Lerge and Madison. I would like to encourage you to give them a warm hand of applause. In closing, I thank you again and hope to see you all back at ICC for next year's T4SD Forum. And please remember that tomorrow at 11:30 we will be hosting a panel together with the Netherlands missions at the WTO, at the WTO in room W, so the big room at your left-hand side as you come in. This panel will debate the nature of partnerships with representatives from the ILO, UN Environment, the WTO, WBCSD, the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our Executive Director, Arantxa Gonzalez. With this, I wish you all a very nice evening. Thank you.